They told you family is where you are safe, where the walls are meant to shield you from the cold cruelty of the world. But what if the very blood you trust carries the seed of your undoing? What if the house you were born into is not a sanctuary, but a prison carved from the marrow of the dead? What if love itself becomes a chain that locks around your throat, tightening each year until you forget how to breathe? I'm going to take you inside such a place. A house that stood far from the cities in the belly of forgotten country, where no priest dared to bless the soil, and no neighbor stayed long enough to speak the family name aloud. You will hear of a girl born into that silence, a girl who never saw the world beyond the timberline because she was never meant to. Her hair, the color of burnt wheat. Her eyes, the shade of winter ponds. Her presence in the house was not an accident. She was not the first child in that lineage to be raised for a role she could not refuse. She was raised to replace someone who was not supposed to be gone. Someone whose memory still lingered in the man she called father, but would later be made to call husband. You think you understand horror, but true horror does not wear fangs. It does not rise from the grave in the moonlight. It breathes beside you at the table. It smiles as it serves your supper. It whispers your name in the dark, while its hands never leave your skin. I am not here to tell you a story. I am here to break a seal placed over a chapter of human history that was buried. Not because it was false, but because it was too dangerous to remember the church knew about it. The law pretended it did not. The elders in the valley would not speak of it even when the wind carried screams from that house in the fog. And if you think this is some ghost story to chill your blood, you are wrong. This is older than ghost tales, older than written law. This is about the valley where this family lived was the kind of place where seasons moved slow, where winter snow seemed to fall in silence, as if the land itself feared to wake something sleeping beneath it. The river bent like a crooked finger pointing toward the house, as though warning you to turn back. But no one ever listened until it was too late. The house itself was built from timber older than the nation, its beams taken from trees that had seen wars long before any white man came. The air inside never warmed, no matter how fierce the fire, and every floorboard seemed to remember every step that had ever crossed it. The locals said the land had been cursed by the ones who lived here first, that it was not meant for plows or fences or the weight of human bones. But the Donnelly bloodline had claimed it anyway, and their roots had sunk deep in more ways than one. It was here in the upper rooms that the girl's childhood ended without ceremony, without words, without a choice. It was here that the man who had raised her began to look at her as if she were not a daughter, but a reflection of the woman he had lost before she was born. They said the resemblance was so perfect that even his hands shook when he brushed her hair, as if he were touching the past made flesh again. But there was no romance in this, only hunger and control, and the slow erasure of the self, for the girl was taught that this was fate, that blood is destiny, and destiny cannot be escaped each day. She dressed in the same garments once worn by the other. Each day her meals were served at the same seat. The other had sat in her every step, traced the life of the one she was replacing, until she no longer knew where that life ended and hers began. In this house, memories were not stories. They were commands, and to disobey meant to lose everything, including the only shelter she had from the snow. The neighbors who still dared pass by would know. There were no wedding papers, no ceremony, no vows spoken before God yet. In the eyes of the man who claimed her, she was both daughter and wife. And in the eyes of the house, she was something far older and darker. The seasons moved over her like waves wearing down stone until she spoke. Les smiled less and carried herself as though the walls were watching her every move. When the first child came, the whispers in the valley grew louder. Some called it sin, others called it tradition. But the truth was worse than either, for it was not love that kept her here. It was the grip of a bloodline that saw her not as a person, but as a vessel. And in that vessel they hoped to preserve something they believed could not be allowed to die, whether it was beauty or name, or something that lived beneath the skin. No one could say the child was pale and silent, with eyes that seemed too old to belong to a newborn, and in those eyes the man saw proof that his will had triumphed over nature. As the years passed, more children came, each bearing the same eyes. The same unsettling quiet, and with each birth the girl who had once been a daughter became harder to find beneath the weight of the role she had been forced to carry. Sometimes she would stand at the edge of the frozen river and stare down into the black water as if waiting for it to speak to her. The neighbors said they saw her lips move, though no sound carried on the wind. It was as if she were speaking to someone far below the surface, someone who had been waiting for her long before she was born. They said the river had a way of keeping secrets, but not forever, and the more the family kept to themselves, the more the valley seemed to lean in, listening for the sound of a crack, in the silence, for in places like this, silence is never empty. It is only gathering its strength before it speaks. Winter deepened and the valley closed in around them like a fist. The snow came heavy and thick, muffling every sound until even the wind seemed afraid to move through the trees. The house stood apart from the others, its chimney breathing thin trails of smoke into the frozen air. Yet no footprints marked the yard except their own. No guests came. No neighbors called, and the mail left at the gate was taken in without a word. The girl's eyes had grown dull, but inside them, there was still a flicker. Something watching, waiting. Her husband and father, both one and the same, had begun speaking less, as if his voice no longer needed to command. For his will was now a part of her bones. He spent his nights in the locked study reading papers so old the ink had bled into the parchment. The children moved through the house in eerie unison, rarely crying, rarely laughing. Always watching, the girl would sometimes wake to find them standing at the foot of the bed, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on her as though they were waiting for an order. They already knew she would give, but could not yet remember the river outside had frozen over. Yet she swore she could still hear it moving beneath the ice, its voice low and constant like a whisper through stone. She began to dream of it every night, standing on the shore in the dark, feeling the water pull at her ankles, though she could not see it. Then one night she woke to find her feet wet. Though the floor was dry, she did not scream. She simply lay back down and closed her eyes. The house listened. The children listened. The man in the study turned another page, as if the sound of her surrender was what he had been reading toward all along. The thaw never came that spring. The snow only grew heavier, as if the seasons themselves refused to pass in this place. The villagers spoke in hushed tones about the Donnelly house, saying the mountain had claimed it, saying the family was no longer entirely human. Those who had seen the girl said her skin had grown pale to the color of candle wax, her hair now falling in strands, as if something inside was feeding on her from within. Her father-husband moved with a slowness that was not weakness but certainty, as though every step was an unspoken command to the earth beneath his boots. The children followed him at a distance, their heads tilted in the same strange angle, their movements so synchronized. It was as if they shared one thought and one breath. The girl began spending hours in front of the mirror, yet not to look at herself. Her eyes searched beyond the reflection as if waiting for someone else to appear. One night she swore she saw her mother's face staring back, though her mother had been dead for years. The mouth in the mirror moved without sound, but she understood the command. Her dreams became heavier, filled with the sound of soil being moved by unseen hands. She woke with the taste of dirt in her mouth and her fingernails black with something she did not remember touching outside. The frozen river began to swell beneath its icy shell. The sound of it was louder now, like the breathing of something vast and ancient. The children began sleeping on the floor near the front door, as if waiting to leave at a moment's notice. And the man in the study now kept the fire burning without pause, his eyes always fixed on the same page, as if the ink itself had trapped him in its design, and somewhere in the dark between the sound of the river and the whispers in the walls, the girl began to understand the truth of what she had become. The days bled together until time itself felt like another prisoner inside the house. The wind pressed against the windows with a voice that carried words almost too faint to hear, and yet the girl could make them out. They were calling her by both names, the one she had as a daughter and the one she now carried as a wife. Each whisper pulled her deeper into a place inside her mind that did not belong to her. The man moved less now and spoke even less, But when he did, his words cut through the air like cold iron. Each command obeyed without thought by every soul. Under that roof, the youngest child stopped speaking altogether, but his eyes never left her face. And at night she would wake to find him standing at the edge of her bed, holding a piece of raw earth in his hands. The air in the house grew damp and heavy, with a smell like old blood mixed with wet stone. In the corners of the room, shadows began to take shapes that held their form too long, as if something waited there. Watching, the girl began to feel an ache in her bones that no warmth could reach, and her skin now bore faint lines like veins of stone crawling across her flesh. The mirror no longer reflected the room, but some dim cavern lit by a pale light in its depths. She could see figures kneeling with their faces turned away, their spines twisted at impossible angles. When she asked the man what they were, he only said, "They are the ones who never left, and you must never turn your back on them." Outside, the river broke through its ice with a sound like bones snapping, and its black water moved faster than it ever had. The villagers said the mountain had awakened, and the Donnelly girl could not shake the feeling that it had done so for her. By the time the thaw had finished, the girl no longer recognized her own hands. The skin had taken on a faint translucent sheen, as if thin layers were being worn away each day beneath it. Something darker pressed forward, something that pulsed with a rhythm older than her own heartbeat. The man began to keep her close, even when she tried to leave the room. His touch was not cruel, yet it carried a weight that pinned her like a chain she could not see. His voice was slower now, almost ceremonial, as if each word had been carved into him long ago and was only being released in her presence. The other children avoided her, their bodies bending slightly away whenever she passed, as though some instinct told them she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The villagers whispered more openly, now claiming they had seen her walking along the frozen river in the middle of the night. Though she swore she had not left the house, she began waking with dirt under her nails and a bitter taste in her mouth that no water could cleanse. One morning she found a small bundle on the floor beside her bed. Inside was a lock of hair bound tightly with a strip of leather damp with something warm when she showed it to the man. He smiled without his eyes changing and said, "It is a promise." The mirror no longer waited for her to approach it. Instead, it began reflecting her movements before she made them, and in those moments her reflection would tilt its head just slightly too far, as if testing the limits of the human neck. The air in the house turned colder than the outside wind, and even the fire gave no warmth. Only light. She began hearing the river's voice, not as a whisper now, but as a steady chant telling her that blood could bind what time could never undo. And she felt the truth of it settling into her bones like frost. The snow deepened until the house seemed cut off from the rest of the earth, a white wall sealing them inside, with no road back to anything she had known, before she woke one morning to find every mirror in the house covered with black cloth. The man told her reflection was a dangerous thing when the mind had been changed, and that sometimes a person might see not themselves, but the truth staring back. She did not ask what that truth might be because part of her already feared. She knew the air inside had grown heavy, scented faintly with herbs and smoke that seemed to cling to her skin even after washing at night. She could hear a soft rhythm somewhere in the walls, like a heart beating in a place where no heart should be. He began teaching her a new way of speaking, not in full sentences but in fragments, meant to bend the mind toward obedience. Each word had weight, each pause an unspoken command, and she found herself obeying. Without question, he brought her books without titles, their pages filled with symbols that swam and shifted when she tried to focus on them. Sometimes she would wake with one of those books open beside her, as though she had been reading in her sleep. The others in the family moved like shadows, now appearing in doorways, then vanishing again, their eyes never blinking long enough for her to tell if they still saw her as a person or as something else entirely. One night, she overheard the man telling them that winter was the season of claiming and that the bond must be sealed before the thaw. When she asked what he meant, he only smiled and placed his hand over hers. It was the first time she noticed the ring on his finger, a twisted band of metal that seemed older than the house, older than the mountains themselves, its surface engraved with the same shifting symbols from the books. And when her eyes met his, she knew that before the snow melted, she would no longer belong to herself. The first snow of the new season fell in silence, as if the sky itself feared to disturb what was already happening inside that house. The man stood at the window, watching the white cover creep across the hills, and when he turned his gaze to her, it felt less like he was looking at her, and more like he was claiming her. The others in the family had begun to act differently around them, their movements slower, their voices lower, as though they too were part of something they could not speak of. She noticed they no longer addressed her by name. Instead, they called her only by a single word in a language she did not know yet. She understood its meaning in her chest. It meant mine. The evenings grew longer, and the man began lighting only one lamp, leaving the rest of the rooms swallowed in darkness during those hours. He would speak to her about bloodlines, about how certain patterns were older than kingdoms, and how the strongest bonds were not made in churches or by law, but in flesh. She felt herself leaning toward his voice, not because she wished to, but because something beneath her skin was drawn to it. The food they ate began to taste strange, as if it carried the memory of the earth it came from, and the dreams it had been born into. She started waking in the middle of the night to find him sitting at the edge of her bed, his hand resting lightly over her heart as though measuring its loyalty. The villagers no longer visited the house. The snow around the front steps remained untouched, no footprints leading in or out except their own. She realized she could no longer remember what her life had been before this winter, as if the world outside had faded into a story someone else once told her, in a voice she no longer trusted. The man's eyes carried a light, one that burned steady and deep like an oil flame. And in that light, she saw her future not in years or places, but in the unbroken circle of his hold. The night of the sealing came without warning, though she felt it in her bones, before she saw the signs. The fire in the hearth burned with a deep crimson glow, as though the wood itself bled light. The air hummed low and constant, like the sound of something vast, breathing just beyond the walls. The others stood in a half circle, their faces half hidden in the shadows, each holding a candle whose flame bent toward her. No matter where she moved, the man stepped forward, wearing a garment that looked woven from strands of hair, its weightless folds whispering with each step. He carried a vessel made from black stone, its surface damp and cold. Even from across the room, inside, was a thick liquid the color of old wine, but darker, almost pulling the light into it. He spoke in that fragmented language, each word cutting into the space between heartbeats, and she felt her knees weaken, not from fear, but from the strange gravity of his voice. They placed her hands over the vessel, and she saw shapes moving in the liquid shapes that mirrored her own face, then dissolved into something she could not name. He told her to drink. She hesitated until the others began humming the same rhythm she had once heard in the walls, and her body obeyed, without asking her mind. She felt the liquid burn through her throat. But the heat was not pain. It was recognition, a memory that was not hers, flooding into her blood, visions of winters she had never lived, faces she had never met, speaking her name in voices that belonged to centuries gone. The man placed the twisted ring in her hand and closed her fingers around it. His touch was steady, unshaking, as he told her that in this family, blood was both beginning and ending, and that now she carried the name and the role no one else could. She looked at the others and saw their eyes soften, not in welcome, but in ownership. And in that moment, She understood that her life had not been consumed. It had been rewritten. The days after the sealing moved like a slow tide, dragging her toward a shore she could not see. Her body woke before dawn, without her willing it, her feet carrying her to the window that overlooked the eastern ridge, where the first light bled across the mountains, in thin red lines. The air felt heavier now, not oppressive, but thick with something unseen. Each sound seemed sharper, each shadow more deliberate. She would reach for a cup and find her hand, pausing halfway, as if remembering another hand had done this. Long before hers, her voice began to shift. 2 words, forming in patterns she did not recognize yet, spoke without effort. The others treated this as natural offering, no explanation, only silent nods, and the faintest curve of lips when they caught her speaking in the old way. The man often stood close, watching her with a gaze that held no lust, yet claimed something deeper. His presence felt less like a person and more like a tether, pulling her into the shape they had carved for her at night. She dreamed of hallways lined with mirrors, each one reflecting not her face, but a different version of it. Younger, older, hollowed, radiant. Sometimes she walked these halls for hours, hearing the same faint hum that had haunted her before the sealing, and when she woke, the sound did not vanish. She began to notice her reflection, moving a heartbeat slower than she did, eyes blinking a fraction. Late, smile fading after she had already turned away. Her chest ached in a way that was not pain, but pressure, as if something vast was waiting to speak through her, yet could not, until she surrendered completely. She tried once to write her thoughts on paper, but the ink bled into the page, forming symbols she could not read, and when she showed it to the others, their faces lit with something between reverence and hungry. And night, standing in the dark corridor, she heard her own voice calling from behind the door. At the far end, it spoke her name twice, then told her to come in, and she realized with a cold certainty that the voice was older than the house itself. The door was not like the others, its frame warped in a way that made it seem older than the rest of the house, as though it had been taken from another place entirely and grafted here. The wood was darker, almost black, and the grain moved like veins under skin. She placed her hand against it and felt a pulse, slow, deliberate, echoing her own heartbeat. For a moment, she could not tell which rhythm was hers and which belonged to the door. The voice came again, softer now but closer, the syllables drawn out like smoke curling through her mind. She turned the handle, and it yielded without sound. The room beyond was narrow and deep, its ceiling lower than it should have been, as though the weight of the earth pressed down upon it. The air tasted of iron and something older than rot. Light came from no single source, but from the walls themselves, which shimmered faintly with patterns that shifted when she tried to focus on them. At the far end sat a chair carved from a single piece of bone, or something like it. In that chair was a shape draped in fabric, the color of dried blood, its head bowed, but its presence filling the space like a storm about to break. She stepped forward, and the figure raised its head slowly, revealing her own face, but thinner, sharper, with eyes that carried centuries of memory. It smiled in a way she had never been able to, and spoke in the language she had begun to dream. In the words translated themselves in her mind, not as meaning, but as command. You are not the first, and you will not be the last. Your blood is a key, and the lock has been waiting since before your first breath. She felt her knees weaken, as if the weight of that truth pressed through her bones. The figure lifted one hand and beckoned her forward, and though every part of her screamed to turn away, her feet moved without hesitation. The figure rose from the chair with a slowness that felt ceremonial, every movement deliberate, as if bound to a rhythm older than time itself, its fabric dragging across the ground with a whisper that reminded her of knives being drawn from leather. The walls tightened, as if the room itself wanted to watch the unveiling. She could feel them bending closer as the air thickened, until every breath felt stolen rather than earned. The figure circled her once, its eyes never leaving hers, as though measuring her weight, not in flesh, but in history. Then it stopped behind her and placed its hands on her shoulders. The skin was cold, yet it burned, and with that touch, visions tore into her mind without warning. She saw a mountain range under a red sky. The peaks shaped like teeth. She saw a woman who bore her same face, cradling a child, not in love, but in ownership, speaking words into its ear that made the child's pupils dilate into black mirrors. She saw blood spilled, not in violence, but in ritual, each drop placed precisely into carved symbols on stone that seemed to breathe when fed. The figure's voice slid into her skull without passing through her ears. This is the root of your name, the first binding, the covenant that made your bloodline more than mortal and less than free. Your mother inherited it, as her mother did before, and the moment you drew your first breath, it became yours. The vision shifted again, showing her family across generations, their faces the same, their eyes the same, each one standing beside a shadow shaped exactly like them, but taller, hungrier. The figure released her and stepped into the corner, where the shadows grew unnaturally deep, its form blending with the darkness, until only its smile remained before fading entirely, leaving her alone in the pulsing room with the scent of blood now thicker than the air itself. She moved toward the door, her steps quick but silent, as though afraid the house would hear the decision forming inside her chest. Her hand reached for the knob, but it was no longer metal. It was warm, like living flesh, and when her fingers closed around it, the surface shifted under her grip as if a pulse ran through it. She yanked her hand back, and the door shuddered in place. Not locked yet, refusing to open, she turned to the window only to find the glass replaced by black stone polished to a mirror that did not reflect her. It reflected someone else, a woman wearing her face, but older, sharper, and dressed in the same deep red as the figure from before. That reflection tilted its head, not matching her own movements, and placed one hand on the glass. Its lips moved slowly, forming words she could not hear yet. The meaning bled into her thoughts. Stay within the blood. Stay within the bond behind her. The hallway no longer stretched straight. It bent and twisted, forming impossible angles and sudden turns like a maze designed to lead her back to the center. The air shifted again, carrying a faint hum that came not from the walls, but from inside her bones, vibrating low and steady, a frequency that seemed to press her deeper into the floor. With each passing second, she tried to speak, to shout for help, but the sound died before leaving her mouth, as though the house itself swallowed it whole. Then, from somewhere above, came the slow drag of footsteps, not in a rush, but certain in their pace, approaching with the confidence of something that knew she could not escape. She pressed her back to the wall, heart hammering, yet knowing that whatever walked those halls had already marked her, not as prey, but as property. The voice began not as a sound, but as a pressure in her skull, like a hand pressing against the inside of her mind, forcing her thoughts into shapes they were never meant to take. The walls around her breathed in and out, their wooden panels expanding and contracting as if feeding on the air. She exhaled. The voice slipped through, then slow and deliberate, speaking in a rhythm older than language, each word folding over itself in layers that clawed at her understanding. "You are not a guest here," it said. "You are the continuation. You are the binding." Her knees weakened under the weight of those syllables, as if each carried the gravity of an entire century. You will not leave, because you are not meant to leave. The voice continued as the ceiling above her darkened, not with shadow, but with liquid black that spread and dripped in long threads, some touching her shoulders and sinking instantly into her skin. With a cold that burned, every drop felt like a signature etched deeper into her marrow. She tried to remember the world outside the fields, the road, the smell of rain on stone, but the images slipped away, replaced by corridors she had never walked, faces she had never met, and rituals she somehow knew the steps to perform. From somewhere deep in the hallway, the figure appeared, now closer than before, eyes like burning coals in a furnace that had been lit for centuries. It raised a hand, and with that gesture, the house stilled. The hum in her bones ceased. The reflection in the blackened window blinked once, slowly. The figure spoke aloud, now the same voice that had filled her head, but heavier, more final. The bond is not broken. The bond is you. And as the words wrapped around her, something in her chest shifted, not in fear, but in a strange acceptance, as if the truth had always been waiting in her blood. The first sign that the ritual had begun was not the flicker of the candles or the low hum rising from the floor, but the sudden awareness that her heartbeat no longer belonged to her. It thudded in perfect unison with the walls, each pulse a slow shudder that rattled the glass in the windows. The air tasted of iron and smoke, though no fire burned, and the shadows on the walls began to shift without light to cast them. They were not her shadows, and they were not the figures. They moved like separate creatures, twisting in shapes that made her stomach knot. The figure stepped forward, and in its hand was an object that seemed alive. A thin length of bone carved with spirals that moved under her gaze, as if they resented being looked at. It placed the bone against her palm, and her skin clung to it, as if unwilling to let go. The hum in the floor deepened into a slow beat, a rhythm that seemed to crawl beneath her skin until she could feel it echoing in her ribs and in the hollow behind her eyes. The figure spoke again, not to her, but into her, a command that reached deeper than thought. Give yourself to the binding. Give yourself to the line. The bone in her hand grew warm, then hot, until it should have burned. But instead, the heat became a pull drawing something out of her. Not blood, not breath, but memory. And in that moment, she saw 100 lifetimes stacked like pages of an unending book, each one carrying the same face, the same eyes, the same voice as hers. Only the names changed, the places shifted, but the bond was always there. She felt the house leaning closer, its beams groaning as if listening to the exchange. The shadows gathered around her feet like dark water, and when she looked down, her reflection stared back from that black surface, its mouth moving before hers could follow, saying the words that would complete the ritual, words she had never learned, but somehow had always known. The words slid from her lips without hesitation, though she could not have repeated them if her life depended on it. They were older than any tongue spoken in this world, carrying a weight that made the air press in on her chest until her breath came shallow. The floor beneath her feet swelled and shifted, as though the house itself was inhaling each syllable, drinking it in like sustenance. The shadows recoiled, only to surge forward, wrapping around her ankles, climbing her legs until they pressed against her skin like cold silk. The figure stepped back into the dimness, but its presence did not fade. It was inside her now, a second pulse beating alongside her own. Her vision blurred at the edges, and she realized the walls of the room were changing, pulling inward, their wood turning darker, wetter, as if saturated with centuries of secrets. The ceiling lowered, or perhaps her body had grown taller, but the effect was the same. The space became suffocating, intimate. The bone in her hand vibrated, and she could feel it, knitting something unseen into her veins. weaving her into the fabric of the house and the house into her. She thought of running, but the thought withered instantly, not because she was trapped though she was, but because the idea itself no longer made sense. The outside world felt thin, unreal, compared to the depth pressing in around her. The hum had become a slow, steady heartbeat, one that was no longer separate from her own in its rhythm. She heard the echo of the bond that had been spoken of since before her birth. The unbroken chain stretching back into generations of faces that all wore her features. The figure's voice returned, this time inside her head. You are sealed now. There is no before, only the bond, only the line. She opened her mouth to deny it, but found she had no voice left, only the same slow heartbeat, thrumming in her ears like a drum calling her deeper. The final moment did not arrive with violence, but with the quiet inevitability of a tide swallowing the shore. The shadows receded only enough for her to see the figure clearly. For the first time, its face was her own, but not as she was now older and yet untouched by age. The eyes carried lifetimes she could not name, filled with knowledge that hurt to recognize. It reached out not with hands, but with the invisible pull of blood and memory drawing her forward until her forehead touched its own, and in that contact every wall in her mind shattered. She saw the first joining centuries ago, in a cabin lit only by firelight. A girl bound to her father in a pact that was less about desire and more about power, a way to seal a lineage against the erosion of time. She saw the same moment repeated over generations, each one believing they had no choice, and yet each one surrendering willingly, because the bond was not just a cage, it was a crown. She felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders, and with it came a flood of voices, her ancestors whispering, not in words, but in a current of intent. It was the will of the family moving through her, shaping her thoughts, aligning her pulse with the hidden rhythm that kept their bloodline alive. The figure smiled and dissolved into her skin, leaving only the sensation of her own body standing alone in the shrinking room. The bone in her hand turned to dust and drifted away, yet its absence felt heavier than when it had been there. She stepped toward the door, though she knew, without seeing, that the world beyond it would not be the same. The air would taste different, the sky would hang lower, and the people who met her eyes would sense something they could not explain. She was no longer just a daughter, no longer just a woman. She was both the heir and the keeper, the child and the bride, the past and the future, bound together in a cycle that would continue long after her name was forgotten. And in that certainty, there was no relief. Only the unshakable truth that the bond was not meant to be broken.